Hey everyone, this is Brian McKee, and I'm really excited to be sharing with you my creative project for the comparative agriculture class. This is something I'm actually really passionate about because it's something I spent my entire summer and part of the semester on. So this was based on a research project that I was actually able to conduct in Kansas this last summer. So in Kansas, I worked with Dr. Jason Bergtold in the Agricultural Economics Department at the Kansas State University where I studied Brazilian sugarcane farmers. So the title of my project is actually examining the relationship that exists between Brazilian sugarcane producers and sugarcane mills. And then following up with that, kind of looking at the management and the trust that exists between these two entities. How can we build it? How do we develop programs around it? And is there actually something there between these two entities that we need to highlight on? So, like I said, I'm really excited to be sharing with you this project because it's something I am really passionate about and have been studying for quite a while. So, just to begin, I'm just going to give you an overview of what we will be discussing. So, kind of the first few areas is we're going to kind of paint a picture of what that relationship looks like. Following that, we're going to go over like a literature review, or more so, just some of the past research that was conducted on contractual agreements. So, ultimately, that relationship that we'll be discussing. We're going to look at the research objectives of our current study, the methodology, which really just means how was my research, how was this study conducted, what parameters did it use. We're going to go to the results, and then finally the conclusion and the discussion. So it might take a while, but I guarantee you it's really interesting stuff, so I hope you enjoy it. So to begin, we're going to identify that relationship. So we know that there obviously must be a relationship between Brazilian sugarcane producers and sugarcane mills, but what does it look like? And in this case, you can probably guess it's contract farming. But for many of you, you might not really know what contract farming is, or why it's irrelevant, or even if it actually happens in other places. So we're going to kind of look at that first. So contract farming, where does it come from? Where has it been? So over the last century, really, it's just become really popular to have contracts between the supply chain members of the agriculture industry, which makes sense. It increases efficiency. So today, there's just many expectations on agribusinesses. Agribusinesses have been transformed worldwide as the public and producers embrace concerns over market transparency and efficiency. We also know that there's just been this increase in pressure on the agriculture industry and therefore agribusinesses to increase world agricultural production by 70% by the year 2050. There's also just thousands upon thousands of limitations on the agriculture industry as a whole. But specifically for the sugarcane industry, there's limitations such as requiring a speedy harvest or processing cycle so that sugarcane can be harvested and then processed as soon as possible. Since sugarcane begins to lose its sucrose value within 72 hours of being harvested, it's very important that this process is as efficient and as fast as possible. Therefore, it obviously paints a very clear picture that our farmers had to adapt, and the way they adapted is through contractual farming. So I'm not going to let you watch the video right now, but you're welcome to watch it if you go through my Prezi. This just gives you a better inner idea of what contract farming looks like, some of the benefits, some of the cons, and really kind of lets you understand more so about the inner details of that relationship, because that's really important to understand when we think about the further research that I will be discussing in a moment. But you can do that at your own time. Great video, though. Next thing that we'll be looking at is some of the past research. So that's kind of looking at the producer's contract agreements. So now that we know that they're in these contracts, are they agreeable? Are they agreeable in them? Do the producers actually desire to be in them? That's what we're going to look at. And so also, what's the big gap in research here that we'll be focusing on? So as you can see, there's a lot of research already conducted on it. One of the most heavily noted pieces of research that I would like to highlight today is that there's been concerns that the benefits of contracts were actually felt primarily by contractors and not so much the producer, which this is a huge concern to us as agriculturalists, meaning that our producers are being more so forced into these contracts, not for benefit, but more so for another reason, which we really are kind of at a question about until we came to this other study. So in Mexico, this study actually notes that producers have to enter into these contracts to have access into a market. So if this is happening, obviously this should just be a major concern to agriculturalists ultimately, that if our producers are only entering into contracts to have access into a market to make a living, then they have no desire to stay in them. They have no desire to be a part of them. So obviously, why are they still doing it? And how do we encourage them while they are in it? Because there is a host of benefits of being in a contract. So we note this gap in research. Studies have been conducted on producers' willingness to enter into contracts, but very little has really been done looking at producers' retention for contracts. And just to continue that idea, convincing farmers to enter into contractual agreements has really just become less of an issue than compared to maintaining producer morale with their contracts. So that's what this study is kind of looking at. How do we continue maintaining that producer morale? How do we make sure our producers are being heard and being felt by the sugarcane mills as well? Finally, past studies have noted that they have used factors such as transaction cost and financial constraints to really kind of paint a picture of why farmers enter into contracts. But they also mentioned that there's been limitations on this. They have not included a full picture, and that full picture, that complete picture, would include other socioeconomic factors. So how large of an operation do they actually have? How many years of production experience do they have? What's their income level as a group? Where are they from? So this study kind of wants to paint the full picture of what that looks like. And we'll get into in a moment what we did specifically to do that. But as we know here, there's a gap in the research, there's this incomplete picture, and that's where this study comes into play. So next, we're going to be looking at the research objectives of this study. So what are we actually hoping to do? And I'm really excited about this next part. So here we go. So research objectives. This study ultimately seeks to evaluate producer acceptance of sugarcane mills that they contract with, and to explore those factors that impact producers' perceptions about their contracts. So those are the socioeconomic factors that we were just discussing. The first objective is the producer's view on contract agreements. And this is an assessment of factors determining if producers desire to be a part of contractual agreements with their local mills. So do they even care to be a part of these contracts? Are they being forced to be a part of them? What is their viewpoint upon these contracts? The next objective here is the producer's perception of contract fulfillment. So this is an assessment of factors that change a producer's perception of sugar mills, follow through on agreements. So do these producers feel like the contracts are being upheld, or are they really just being screwed over by the larger operations of sugarcane mills? And then following that, we have the producer's trust of a mill's management and of their direction. So this is more of an assessment of the producer's agreement on mill's transparency and of their leadership team. So I bet you're all wondering how exactly I was able to conduct this research. So that's what we're going to be discussing here with the methodology. So this was a study that was conducted using survey information that was gathered from 22 counties in Brazil inside the states of Goiás and Mato Grosso do Sul. So in 2014, there was actually 148 landowners and producers who were interviewed, but only 103 of those participants were producers who currently involved in contractual agreements with a local sugarcane mill. Therefore, they were able to produce. Therefore, these individuals were the ones that we were focused on for this study. So they became our sample population. Using Stata was the next step that we did. So Stata is the statistical analysis tool that we ultimately used. We studied the research using ordinal logistic regression models that we'll get into a moment in our results section. We looked at statistical significance at a 1%, 5%, and a 10% level of significance. And then the really important part here that we want to talk about is our variables. So we have 4 dependent variables and 21 independent variables. So there's a lot going on right now, but I'm sure we're going to be able to get through it. So I'm just going to try to do it slowly and clearly. That way we really paint a picture of what our objectives are still and where we're going with them. So to begin, we have our dependent variables. So these were categorical variables. That means that essentially we are given a statement here, and then we have a level of agreement in this case that we're talking about. So we use Likert type scales. That is a 1 to 5 scale that's given a qualitative value. So for example here, strongly disagree is 1. to disagree 2, neutral 3, agree 4, strongly agree 5. So they're given a statement. I wish I could accomplish my objectives without a contract with a mill. The farmer or producer would then say, I agree with that statement. So they would put down a 4 for them ultimately. As well, we have statements like, do you feel the mill has not fulfilled its side of the contract? So yes, a great deal. I feel the mill has not fulfilled their contract. Or no, never. The mill has always fulfilled their contract. We have, I trust the management of the mill, also based on that Likert type scale. And I always trust the direction the mill will do as promised. Once again, strongly disagree to strongly agree. Then we have a lot of categorical variables. So these are given more statements, and based upon that 1 to 5 scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. So an example here is a good relationship with the local mill is important for my business. So the farmer might say, I agree with that statement. As well, we have here, my profits have decreased since signing the contract with the mill. So the farmer might say, I strongly disagree that my profits have decreased since signing the contract with the mill, meaning more so that they agree that their contracts have increased, or that their profits have increased since signing a contract. We have independent indicator variables. So these are variables such as yes or no questions. So for example here, we have a dummy variable indicating whether the respondent was a land rent contract holder, or they were an agricultural partnership contract holder, or they were a supply versus being a supply contract holder. Then we also have dummy variables such as indicating whether the respondent produced in Mato Grosso do Sul versus Goiás. A dummy variable indicating whether the producer understands their contract agreement. So yes, they understand it. No, they do not understand it. And then a late payment. The dummy indicated whether the producer has received a late payment before or not. So yes, I have. No, I haven't. And then we have some other independent variables, such as income of the household, the number of mills available to the producer in that region, the year the producer began producing, so that's the level of experience, and then sales, how large is their production and total sales. Now we actually get into the core of the study, which is the results section. So once again, there's a lot going on here. I'm just going to take it slowly. We're going to look at everything that's kind of significant, and we're just going to try to do this as clearly as possible. So the first thing that we'll be looking at here is the producer's view on contractual agreements. So those of you who have never looked at a regression model before, I'm just going to try to do this as clearly as possible. So we have our parameter estimates, which kind of then points, so if they are this variable, then they're more likely to be this. And their standard errors, which means how exact are those parameter estimates. So therefore, if it's significant, which means it has an asterisk next to it, then those variables are something we should look at. So in this case, if there is a 1 asterisk beside it, in this case year, that means that there is a 10% level of significance. 2 means that there's a 5% level of significance, and then 3 means that there's a 1% level of significance. So this is very significant, something that you can really count on, therefore. So we have, in this case here, F2, which is our first significant variable, which means here that a farmers cooperative and association are involved. So if the producer feels that they want to be a part of a farmer cooperative or association, then they're more likely or less likely to have an agreeable view on contractual agreements. Then we have F3, which kind of says the same thing here. So in this case, it says that if the view or if the individual desires to be a part of a national-owned company, then they have a less agreeable view on contracts. So once again, if they desire to be a part of those entities, they have a less agreeable view on those things. We have understand, which is at the top right of this graph. So this kind of tells us that if the individual understands their contract, because of that negative parameter, they actually have a less agreeable view on their contract. So if they understand it, they are less likely to agree with it. M1, which says that if they've experienced a decrease in income, then they are more likely to not agree with their contract, which makes sense that if they don't get as much money, they're not going to be happy with it. We have years of experience, which is something funny here to note. It's the only parameter estimate that we have positive that's significant. So the interesting thing here is that the more experience that we have, or the more experience these producers have, the more likely they are to agree with their contract agreements, which is kind of goes into the viewpoint of you get more conservative in your old age, less likely to take risk, and therefore, obviously, if you are involved in a contract, you know that you're going to get some type of profit at the end of the day. And then we have sales, which tells us that the larger the operation is, the less likely I am to agree with having my contract. Following that, we have the producer's perception of contractual fulfillment. So the first variable that we have here that's significant is on the left side, the third one down, which is location Mato Grosso. So this tells us, because of that negative parameter, that actually if they are from Mato Grosso do Sul, they are less likely to feel fulfilled than as opposed to being from Goiás, which is just an interesting comparison between those two states inside the country of Brazil. As well, a significant variable here is lateness. So if they've ever received a late payment, they are less likely to feel fulfilled on those. They are less likely to feel fulfilled on their contract agreements, which makes sense that the contract is not being upheld, therefore they don't feel fulfilled in it. And then M5 down there, the third one right here in this case, which tells us that if they are receiving a fair value for their product, they are more likely to feel fulfilled in their contract agreements. And then sales, which tells us that the larger the operation is, the more likely they are to feel fulfilled in their contracts, which makes sense to us because the larger the operation is, obviously those are the contracts we're going to be most concerned with as a sugarcane mill, because our smaller producers are not as important to us as our larger producers because they bring in less money. As well, here we have the producer's trust of mill's management. So the first variable, there's a lot that's significant here, so we're going to take this slowly, is F1. So in F1 here, this tells us that if we have a good relationship with the mill's management, then we're more likely to trust them. F3, which tells us that if they are from a national-owned company, or if we desire to be a part of a national-owned company, we are more likely to trust them. F5, which tells us that if the more farmers in the region that trust the local mill, the more likely I as a farmer am going to trust the local mill, which makes sense. Farmers are very communicative and community-based. Therefore, they are more likely to be desiring, I'm sorry, I was reading that text message. Therefore, these farmers are more likely to pick up on the opinions of other farmers. We have F6, which means that ultimately it's difficult to sign a contract. That means I'm less likely to feel like I can trust the mill's management. So therefore, if it's hard for me to sign a contract with you, I'm not going to feel like I'm going to trust you as much. F7, which tells us that the higher the bargaining power of other producers, the more likely I am to feel less trust for the mill's management. So I'm going to say that one again. So if I feel like other producers have higher bargaining power than me, then ultimately I'm going to trust that mill's management less so because they are not giving me what I rightfully deserve. And then M3, which tells us that the harder it is to communicate with the mill, the less likely I am to trust the mill. Or vice versa, the easier it is for me to communicate with the mill, the more likely I am to trust the mill's management. So communication is key, as we know. We finally have the producer's trust of mill's direction. So the first thing that we'll be discussing here is F1, which tells us that if we have a good relationship with the mill, we're more likely to trust the mill's direction, which makes sense. So strong relationships build trust. F5, which tells us that if farmers in the region, once again, have trust in the mill, then I am more likely to trust the mill. F3, which tells us that if it's easy for me to communicate with the mill, the more likely I am to trust the mill's direction. So once again, communication is key, relationships are key. Also, those relationships with other farmers is key here in building trust. Now we get into the really interesting stuff, the conclusion discussion. So once again, this is just some of the highlights of our results that we're going to be discussing and some of the implementations or implications that we can use from these. So the first thing that we'll be looking at is the producer's view on contract agreements. So the first thing is that we note here that there's a concerning factor of discussion is that A concerning factor of discussion is that producers who identified more with understanding their contracts were also more likely to desire to not be a part of contracts in the future. This has potential concern for us that contracts are actually unfair for producers, or at the least, they are undesirable means for marketing their crop. Therefore, if they really understand their contracts, they don't want to be a part of them, so they obviously feel uncheated upon them. We have that the larger the operation was, the more likely farmers were displeased with their contracts. This could potentially be a hindrance for sugarcane production in the future, for growth in the future of Brazil, considering that past literature has proven contracts to be a production catalyst. So once again, so the larger production is, they're more likely to be displeased with contracts. So they're not going to want to be in contracts. If they don't want to be in part of contracts, then efficiency is going to go down. So this is obviously a major contention issue. But obviously we know that in the past, contract agreements are more likely to pop up. So maybe this is not a big issue as compared to others. And then we have their cooperations, or the cooperatives that they're a part of, or the associations, or the national-owned companies. So in this case, we identified that all these variables, producers would rather be a part of a farm or cooperative or association or national-owned company, and they desire less to be a part of a contract. So that's just something interesting to note here. What is it about those entities that are so appealing to producers that are not appealing to producers through contracts? We also have the producer's perception of contract fulfillment. So the first thing that we'll be looking at here is the fair value. So producers believe that if they receive a fair value for their product, this is a strong indicator of their belief that the contract has been upheld. So once again, if they get a fair value for their stuff, then they feel like their contract's being fulfilled. So that's an easy thing for us to implement in the future, obviously. We just want to see what is a fair value to the producer. As well, the study saw that the larger the production, so that sales variable, the more likely they were to believe their contract was being fulfilled. So this, once again, as I kind of discussed before, mills are more likely to make sure they follow through on larger contracts for the sake of business. And then 78%. So since 78% of respondents feel as if their contracts have been fulfilled when these factors may be of less importance. So at the very beginning of this, some of the descriptive statistics that we did, a lot of these respondents already said they feel fulfilled. So this variable, this dependent variable of looking at perceptions of contract fulfillment may be of less importance than compared to other dependent variables in this study. We have the producer's trust of mills. So this, once again, major factors contributing to producers' trust in mills management are the considerations the producer has for their relationship with the mill. So these variables are F1, F3, F6, those significant variables, and then the relationship with other producers have with the mill, so F5 and F7. So relationships are very key here in trust with the mills. So that's my relationship with the mill and others' relationship with the mill. So that develops trust. As well as contract negotiations. So if I'm having a difficult contract negotiation, I as a farmer am less likely to trust the mill. So these considerations should be weighed by contractors. Ultimately, when negotiating those contracts, are they willing to put up a hard bargaining in order, and ultimately are going to lose trust in their producers? So that's a consideration, a give and take that they have to consider. As well, we have unfair advantages. So if producers perceive unfair advantages to other producers, such as with contract negotiations, F9, they will be less trusting of the mill. So once again, if I think that others have an unfair advantage over me as a farmer, then I'm less likely to trust the mill because I feel cheaped or not as benefited by the same contracts that they have. And then finally, communication. Communication is definitely key here. Producers find it difficult to communicate with the mill. They are less likely to trust the mill. So we want to build communication between these two parties, ultimately so we can build trust. So recommendations. So some future research that we really want to highlight on, because obviously this research kind of filled a gap and kind of opened up some new questions as well. So researchers in the future should spend some time studying farmer cooperatives or associations or national-owned companies. So what is it about those entities that ultimately, what are those attributes that are so appealing to producers that are not appealing or not a part of contracts? And are any of those attributes able to then be implemented inside contracts in order to be more appealing to producers in the future? As well, we note that further research should be conducted on what producers define as a fair value. So this looks at what factors affect producers' perception of what is a fair value. So if we're able to change what a fair value is to the producer, then they're more likely to feel fulfilled. They're more likely to feel trusting of the sugarcane mills in the future. So if we change fair price, what are those factors? And then also further research on the relationship between trust and desiring to stay with a contract should be conducted. So is there a correlation or a causation between these two factors? That should be really the next step as well. Finally, we have our references. So there's a lot of references here. You're welcome to look through them. All great stuff. Thank you very much. I know it's a long, very long video, but I really enjoyed sharing it with you. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Have a great day.